Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, digging books that aren't drier than dirt. I'm your host, Tristan Harenstein, and with me as always is my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hello, everybody.
And today we are very excited because we are starting a brand new book titled Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, Science and Pseudoscience in Archaeology by Kenneth L. Feder. Now, this is a book we had that poll, and you all voted for this one. So we're kind of excited to dive in and find out what it's going to offer us. And I'll tell you right now, from the first section we read, I think it's very promising. I think we're going to have fun with it.
Yeah, it's definitely different than the last book we tackled.
Very different.
But I like that we're doing something a little different. And I think talking about pseudoscience is always, if nothing else, entertaining. But I think this is also, he does a really good job of being informational as well. It's not just berating those that may believe in pseudoscientific theories and stuff.
Yeah, he's got an edge to him, but he's more about why do people think this way and why are these things successful, so far anyway.
Yeah, I was a little worried at first, and I know you and I are both reading different editions of the book, which we did on purpose because we were kind of curious over time how these theories may have changed and what new information may have been made available. But he made a couple jokes at the beginning in the first chapter in my edition, and I was like, oh goodness, I like the edge, I like the humor, but I hope it doesn't come to the point where it's like berating people who believe in certain things that we know not to be scientific, because we don't want to do that either. But it didn't seem that way in the chapters that followed.
Yeah, I've seen some popular scientists that seem to do that, and even though I agree with their points, it doesn't feel good. It feels like punching down almost.
Yeah, and I think, we're trying to create a bridge between the two and try and foster an understanding, and that doesn't do any of that. That just if
we make people feel bad, then they're just going to double down on their beliefs rather than listen, which they might do anyway, but we don't have a chance otherwise. Anyway, just a reminder, something we talked about last episode was that if you are looking at this book to read along, the newest edition is quite pricey, but you can find older editions that are much more reasonable. I am working with the newest 10th edition, which was last updated in 2018, and Barbara is actually working with an older edition.
Yeah, I have the 6th edition, which is 2008, and I bought it used for like $6.
Yeah, we're going to have some fun, I think, comparing, because we weren't really knowing what to expect, but when we started trying to decide on how much we were going to read, we realized the chapters do not line up very well. And so it was a bit of a struggle to figure out how we're going to divide this up so one of us isn't like loaded with half the book in one go and that kind of thing. So we read through chapter 4, and that worked out pretty well. Before we move into the main event here, though, I want to take a moment and ask that if you are watching this on YouTube, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, engage with that algorithm. If you're listening to this as a podcast, please leave us a review, and we will have questions also that you can engage with. At least if you're on Spotify, please do engage with those questions. All those helps the algorithm and helps us get the word out. Plus, we really like getting feedback and hearing what people think. Also, some very big news for us as the podcast is just recently we attended the 2024 Tallahassee-Leon County Historic Preservation Award, and we received the Preservation Education Award of Excellence.
Yay!
So we are officially an award-winning podcast.
Look at us go. One last thing, as some of you may have noticed, we did have our special episode with author of Artifacts, the Faye Longchamp Mystery, which was the last book we read. Marianna Evans joined us, and we just want to give her a shout out and a huge thank you for taking the time out of her busy schedule, especially at the end of the semester, to talk with us. It was a wonderful interview, and if you haven't listened to it yet, I highly encourage that you do so.
So without further ado, let's dive into Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries. Like we said, I'm going to be very interested to see how different our editions are, because I have a sense just from his preface that it has updated this quite a bit from the previous edition, and yours is 2 or 3 older than this one even.
Yeah, I know. In my preface, he mentions the internet, and you could tell it's kind of still a early thing, and he mentions it as a place with exciting implications for disseminating information about the human past. Also means more misinformation.
That's interesting that he was picking up on that because obviously that's become a major, major problem in more recent years, especially.
Yeah, he saw it coming.
He sure did. One of the first things that struck me was how present the author's voice is in this. Because one of the things that's going to make this different, and one of the reasons it's so pricey, is because this is kind of designed to be a textbook. But it's not like any textbook I've had before, and it's probably like the kind of textbook we all wish we'd had in school.
Yeah.
Because it's fun to read, it's very easily digestible, it makes its points very clearly and simply.
He talks a little bit in my edition about the process of getting this in classes. Like a lot of people really, at first at least, in different university anthropology and archaeology departments didn't really see the point. And they were like, why would we have a whole entire book or a whole entire class dedicated to this issue? And it makes me think that seeing this as an issue is something that is kind of relatively recent within the last decade or so, you know?
I think it's something that we have had to, like at FPAN, we have been pushing for people to be more aware of, even within our discipline.
Yeah.
We've done a number of things, posters at conferences and stuff, trying to raise awareness of this. And it's an uphill battle because people don't necessarily always want to deal with it either.
And it's interesting that even in 2008, he's understanding that there are possibly detrimental or damaging issues that can come about as a result of these seamlessly kind of innocent, misinformed theories that come out there. And, you know, there's broader implications, and a lot of them aren't so kind and have roots in things like racism and stuff that even in 2008, he was recognizing that, which I'm trying to think like 2008. I don't know that that was as on our radar as it is now. I
think we were seeing, I don't know if he mentions, but I think we were seeing like the shift in the History Channel at that point.
Yeah,
which is interesting because in the time he updates for my version, it's fully happened. He's just very derogatory towards the History Channel.
In my book, in chapter 1, I believe it is, he mentions one documentary. It was about King Tut's tomb and the curse, and it was apparently on the National Geographic Channel, but it talked about the curse, not necessarily like the truth behind what actually happened, but the curse, how Carter and all the archaeologists died, and they kind of dove deep into that on the National Geographic Channel back, I guess this was pre-2008, but kind of recent. And he talks about some studies that show how a large portion of people believe in pseudoscience and extrasensory perception and things like that a lot.
Yeah. Some of the things that stood out to me in the preface especially, he did quite a bit of talking about how science isn't well represented by clickbaity headlines, as his term.
Oh, wow.
And he did quite a bit of talk about that. Every time you see science is proved something new, exciting discovery, it's like, well, no, it's been a long, slow process. It's probably not as certain. It may not be as certain as they present it. And questions like he pointed out a headline that was like, century-old mystery of Piltdown Man hoax finally solved. This happened fairly recently. And as we'll find out, no, that was solved half a century ago. He said it should have read, scientists add a bit to our understanding of the Piltdown fraud and confirm what we were already pretty sure about. Which of course is not as catchy of headline, but it is much more accurate in that detailing what actually was going on. He's just kind of talking about how basically I think we need to be a little more aware of how scientific process works and a little more skeptical of these headlines in particular and try not to fall for them, even though he has a number of examples of when he himself falls for them.
Yeah.
So he's not saying he's immune either. It's just a constant thing we have to work for.
Well, and throughout at least the first section we read, there's been a couple times where he talks specifically about how scientists succumb to frauds. We want something to be true so badly that we kind of lose sight of the scientific process sometimes, especially early on when the scientific process wasn't as well developed, as well mapped out as it is now.
I think there are more recent cases, though, where that, not necessarily in archaeology, but I can think of at least one other case where you look at it and you say the scientific process failed, whereas in reality, you can say maybe it failed for a while, but it corrected itself eventually. And we'll look at that and talk about that some more.
Yeah.
He did have a whole section, What's in the 10th edition, detailing some of his changes in this one as well, in the preface. Particularly in chapter 1, he starts with talking about consistency conspiracy theory and the value of expertise, which, of course, is a good thing, not a necessarily terrible thing as some people present it. The others were pretty straightforward, and I think we'll get to some of these as we come to them, but I particularly like his description of Chapter 3, which we'll cover today. Here's where I admit the Cardiff Giant is actually the petrified remains of a biblical Nephilim. Kidding, it's just a stupid chunk of gypsum. So that gives you a good idea of his sense of humor here, which it doesn't make me roll on the floor, but I got some good chuckles out of it.
Yeah,
for sure.
it definitely kind of breaks up the seriousness and heaviness of a lot of the topic.
It lightens it up for sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I thought it was funny because in my edition, one of the big major changes he made was a best of the web section.
Oh, interesting.
Where he, at the end of each chapter, he lists websites that talk about whatever the topic is in that chapter. I didn't have a chance to visit all of them, but some of them still exist and have been updated. Some don't exist anymore. But I thought it was an interesting thing to do, especially for a textbook, because I can imagine as a student, if you're writing papers, it kind of helps. I mean, you and I see a lot of times, because we both judge the Florida History Fair, students using less than reputable sources.
Mhm.
And so I thought it was interesting in a textbook to have like, hey, these are things that I think you should go to and check out.
Well, it's interesting because he apparently has abandoned that entirely in this edition, at least, because that's not at present anymore. He does provide some in-text website things for things he's talking about, but probably at this point he's figured out that the web just changes too much to make that really a useful thing to do, which would be my assumption, but not necessarily something I would have thought in 2008.
Yeah, he also has at the end of each chapter an FAQ.
He does in mine as well.
Yeah, okay, interesting.
He also ends the preface with a pseudoscience cheat sheet. And it's designed to kind of help you identify poor science. And it's interesting, but I thought it was a little wordy, especially for the podcast. You might be seeing a few of it as social media posts or something on the line. I thought that was an interesting concept. So that's a bit of the FAQ and the little end of chapter resources and critical thinking exercises. That's where the textbook stuff kind of comes through. Otherwise, it just reads like a very pleasant to read book, I would say.
Yeah, similar to your kind of cheat sheet, he has a quick start guide in this version. And it just kind of talks you through like how to look at a source and see if it's reputable, if who's making the claim,
right?
Things like that. What is the motive of the person making the claim? And he mentions how he just purchased a digital camera and he's really excited because he no longer needs to scatter slides everywhere and dig through all these slides. It's all just on a screen in front of him.
Ain't technology fascinating?
Yep.
Definitely is not present in this version. He's definitely updated it. So moving on to the first chapter, titled simply Science and Pseudoscience, on my version anyway.
Yes, Science and Pseudoscience in mine as well.
This chapter is really all about kind of what is the scientific process and how does it work, which sounds maybe boring or something you already feel like you understand, but frankly, this is worth giving a look, I would say. At the very least, it gives you an idea of an archaeological perspective on science, but the scientific process is still the scientific process, and he breaks it down very nice, accessible, and fun to read way, I would say.
And I think it's also interesting because I'll be honest, I know what pseudoscience is and how it relates to archaeology, but there's some things that I have never really thought much about that are considered pseudoscience. In my chapter, he starts out discussing pseudoscience and what it is and how people that we don't necessarily expect would believe in stuff that is considered pseudoscience actually do. And one of the things he points out is there were studies and a lot of college students believe in things that we would consider pseudoscience.
Yes, and he, of course, talks about that in my book, too, but he'll probably have more updated information in this case.
Yeah, I would imagine so. Mine is a 2005 Gallup poll where he mentions multiple polls, but this is the one where the first one, he really goes into depth in this one. And he said that of those surveyed, 41% believed in things like extrasensory perception, ESP, and 26 believe that some people can tell the future, and 37% believed in ghosts. So just to kind of give people an idea of things that would be considered pseudoscience, and to make people understand that this is something that's not off in a corner somewhere where only a couple people believe in it. It's something that's out there, and especially now, I would imagine with the internet, it's just all over the place. People will read things or play with Ouija boards and things like that. And we don't necessarily believe it, but it's just something for fun. But then there's people that do actually believe that stuff too.
Yeah, actually, in this section, in my version, he has for a number of years, he and a colleague have been running a poll with his students. And that's one of his big points, is that we think of education as inoculation to these beliefs, but he's finding very much that is not the case. And it's interesting because he charts over the years rise and fall in different beliefs, like belief in Atlantis. It had a peak and then it went down and then it went back up. Not that these are like Gallup polls that detail, but it gives you some indication that for some reason these kind of get more popular and then they fade and they get popular again. It's interesting, and his point is just kind of how many people, his students who are in college, actually have some of these beliefs too.
Yeah, he mentions that in this version as well. And another thing that I found interesting is he talks about how there's this idea out there that kind of reinforces a lot of pseudoscience, the idea that scientists are trying to hide things from the public. You and I have dealt with this, people saying archaeologists hide the artifacts so the public can't see them because we don't want them to know the truth and stuff like that. And, and then of course, one that everybody's familiar with is like Area 51,
Right.
The mystery behind Area 51 and things like that. We don't.
No, he talks about that. He personally gets a lot of accusations because he's the author of these books, too.
Oh, I can only imagine.
Yeah. And his question about a lot of these things is like, he phrases it very nicely. Although what would be so terrible about it that I would feel compelled to hide it is a question I have never had satisfactorily answered. And that's the thing, right? When it comes to the idea that so-and-so is hiding it, that's why we don't have the evidence for it. Like, why? Most of the time, why would we care enough? We would be excited about these things. It would be amazing. It would change how we interpret this stuff. He's particularly talking about the idea of an ancient race of giants, which is a thing. And he's like, if there were giant humans, why would the Smithsonian hide all the evidence? First of all, and then how could they possibly manage it too? They'd be showing up all over the world, and just the sheer number of people and money that would be invested in just hiding it is ridiculous.
Well, and it's interesting to me too, because hiding it, I feel like would have only gotten more difficult throughout time, because now, there's cameras everywhere, right? And there's the internet and all these things. You're never really alone. You can get hacked. Like, all of our information is digital. So not only why, but how? How on earth would we hide these things? It'd be so difficult.
I was a little amused by this because he does talk about research that showed how the more people get involved with anything, any secret, the more impossible it becomes to hide that secret. And I thought, but who conducted that experiment? That's the kind of circular logic, I think, sometimes. Particularly, he cites the moon landing in this case. And so one study, the scientists, again, found that it would involve about 15 million people to hide the moon landing, the fake moon landing. Like, that's simply not possible that would stay secret.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. I thought it was interesting, too, because in my version, he talks about how he was surprised to find a connection between like the occult and archaeology, so like mysticism and things like that. And I was like, wow, to be surprised by that is interesting, because to me, I know you and I talk to a lot of people, and maybe we have more interactions than most archaeologists with general members of the public, but we hear that all the time,
yes.
Like both religion and just like the occult, there's such a strong connection, and it makes sense, because we always tell people, archaeology is useful in that it provides like tangible evidence of something from the past. And when you have a really, really strong belief, using archaeology to kind of prove your belief system is really powerful. So of course there's that will and that desire to have that. And he talks about that later on in the book.
Does he talk about his own brush with being personally invested in conspiracy theories in your version?
A little bit. He doesn't tie too much into it.
That's interesting, because he does go into it quite a bit in this version. In particular, when he was younger, he was getting very invested in a lot of these conspiracy theories, tall tales, got a collection of books. And one of the books was, engineering and stuff. He's like, oh, this sounds so plausible. Then he gets to one where he has a lot of expertise in archaeology. And he's like, wait a minute, this is all nonsense. Then he's like, wait, did the other one sound plausible because I didn't have enough expertise in it? Is this the same? And he kind of dug into it. It's like, no, this is any expert in these areas sees this the same way I see the archaeology. But I like it as a good example of, talking about how he himself, the author of this book for how many years, had a brush with it, and how, when evidence presented itself, he changed his mind, which is something that's hard to do for everybody. But it's very important in science when evidence presents itself that we are willing to change our mind on things.
Right. Yeah. A lot of people think of science as like concrete, and science is something that is ever changing based on new information. That's
by design.
Yeah, that's the beauty of science.
And when it changes, it's not a failure, it is succeeding.
Yeah. He does talk about how, and I'm sure I'd be curious to see what he says about this in your version. He says, because archaeologists often talk to each other, right, at conferences and things like that, the public often learns about archaeology from like mass market produced paperbacks and tabloids and maybe TV shows and things like that don't necessarily, the editor, he's like, even if they have archaeologists being interviewed, it's edited, right? And you only have, as we know, you only have so much control over how something is edited or portrayed after you do your interview. Does he talk about that at all in your version? Because I'd be curious to see like what he uses, because he talks a lot in mine about tabloids, which I thought was fascinating.
That might be the talk about the headline stuff in my version more.
Yeah, okay, that would make sense.
Might be where that went.
Yeah.
Because definitely no talk about tabloids other than maybe a passing mention. But does he kind of break down why pseudoscience happens in yours? I thought that was well done.
Yeah, one thing he does in this chapter is he talks about like the motivations for like pushing fake.
And this is pretty surface level right now. The rest of the book kind of dives into more of these motivations.
Yeah, but he talks about the ones he mentions are money, fame, nationalism, and
nationalism is a big one.
Yeah, he's mentioned specifically in my book the Nazis.
That's kind of the go-to case, although I would say that it's not just the Nazis.
Oh, no, definitely not.
United States has taken part in that in a big way. Not just the United States. When we did For Lost Cities, we talked about Angkor Wat and how the archaeology and interpretation of Angkor was pushing the colonialist narrative. So it justified for the French the colonialist agenda. Yeah. And that is not a new thing. That's not a unique thing to just the Nazis, but they're the most obvious and most egregious, I would say.
And then, of course, religion, which we've already talked a little bit about, and the desire for a more, quote, romantic past, romanticized past. And then also he mentions, which I thought was interesting for 2008, mental health issues also play a role.
Yeah.
And
a lot of the cases where we have had people come to us with particular ideas, I sometimes wonder if that's not a factor in what we're dealing with there.
Yeah.
He does also, in mine, just list the thrill of the myth, the spookiness, and that is being appeal. And I can get that one. Like you mentioned, the legend of the curse of the pyramid. King Tut. That's what that's about. It's about the thrill of that story, and it's spooky and kind of fun. But the problem becomes when people can't separate the fun story from the reality sometimes. And as we'll see, I think eventually, sometimes those fun stories are much less fun than it might seem like on the surface. He does do a good job of talking about asking questions, kind of countering some of his stuff. Like, he talks about how all the different myths and such and how they're not right. And he's like, well, should we dismiss them so quickly? And so then he kind of goes into a bit about that. I think we'll touch on that more throughout the book, so I'm not going to worry about it too much here, but it was very nicely done. Towards the end of this chapter, he has a section titled, Expertise, It's Not a Guarantee, but It Sure Beats the Alternative. And so this is kind of addressing a trend that he runs into where expertise in a subject is seen as a weakness to people who believe in these things. Like they are stuck in their ideas and not open to these ideas, or they are too attached to the status quo, or a part of some greater conspiracy theory in academia or something, which we've talked about the sheer number of people that would evolve. It's just not practical. Or frankly, most of the time, like we wouldn't want to. It would be fascinating if these things were true.
Yeah, the end of my chapter kind of ends with the reason he wrote this book, which is essentially just to provide like professional perspective on these unsubstantiated claims and discuss the issues with them and how they happen, how they kind of affect what people learn and what people know. But he does have a list of books in here that are kind of like his list of books that discuss other sciences. He's like, this book is about archaeology, but there's many other books out there that discuss like pseudoscience and other disciplines, which I thought was really interesting. And there's a lot of them, which it's interesting because I would never, I mean, everything from the Loch Ness monster to the Indian rope trick, which I don't even know what that is, bad astronomy, like everything. Yeah. So
he doesn't do that in mine. He does actually have a personal story, though, that I thought was a pretty good illustration of some of his frustration with this. He was apparently at some place and doing a talk, and someone came up to him afterwards with three ring binders of evidence.
Oh boy.
And it was photo upon photo of large isolated boulders. And I think the idea being presented was, I don't remember if it was supposed to be giants that were moving around or what the case may be, but this person saw them as evidence of supernatural. And he, having, at least a little bit of training in geology, is like, well, these are what they call them erratics. So they are simply large boulders that were moved by glaciers. And you can tell, you can even trace them and where they came from and everything. And the response he got was, I don't know anything about geology, but I know these aren't erratics. He just kind of effectively expressed his kind of frustration with that perspective, because you just admitted you don't know anything about this and you just said it's not true. It's like that kind of circular thinking can be very difficult. And he also says at some point he genuinely thinks archaeology is fascinating, finds these pseudoscientific explanations for things very frustrating, which I totally get.
Yes.
The number of times I've had people tell me the pyramids were built by aliens, and a couple times I've had a very good conversation just kind of saying, well, I feel like that really kind of diminishes the accomplishment of the people who built it.
Yeah.
Because that is true. And that's sometimes, we'll get to that, I'm sure, sometimes the point of those kinds of things too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I've definitely had my frustrations with it. And, it's interesting because when you're speaking to as many people as we speak to, you sometimes get people that are really open to having an actual discussion with you about it and learning about the object. And they're like, oh my gosh, I thought it was this, but now that you say that totally makes sense or whatever. But then you also get the people who are essentially, it's like they just want to stump you, But I enjoy talking to all of them because I think it's important for us as scientists to understand what kind of information is being passed around out there. It's important to us. I think it makes us better scientists, better at communicating scientific ideas if we have a way to open the door and kind of bridge these topics, because the internet exists.
Right.
They're always going to be out there. And
a good example of this that I've run into personally was the whole ancient aliens thing.
Mm-hmm.
And, there was a time, actually about the time your book was written in particular, I thought, oh, it's just goofy nonsense. It's kind of fun. I wasn't too worried about it. But once I had to engage with it and look into it deeper, and we'll probably talk about this when we get to the subject a bit more, I came to more fully realize the problems with that in the roots of that myth, I guess.
Yeah. And I mean, I've noticed too, when you do talk to people about it, quite often they're like, oh, I never really thought about that.
Right. And to be clear, when we talk about these things, if you've bought into it and we tell you there's actually racist roots in this myth, which is often the case, we're not telling you that to make you feel bad, because we don't doubt that you didn't know that. Because like I said, I didn't know that with the ancient aliens.
Yeah.
But we need to understand that aspect of these things. It's very important that we do that.
And I think that's why I think it's very valuable that the author provides kind of what is called a quick guide in my book, just like questions to ask yourself when you're reading something online or in a magazine or whatever. Like, there's things you should ask yourself to kind of get an idea as to how valid this claim is.
Yeah.
And remember, the greater the claim, the more wild and out there it seems, the more evidence it's going to take to prove that. So ask yourself too, okay, what is the evidence? And is it...
Importantly, I think to one of his major points in this chapter is, what do the experts think of this evidence? Because if you aren't personally an expert in this field, it can sound very convincing. Like he said when he was reading about, engineering stuff and astronomy stuff when he was younger, he, not being an expert in it, they sounded very convincing. So look into that yourself as well, I would recommend.
Yeah.
Don't just take it at face value.
And most scientists, if you come up to them and ask them the question, that's their passion, that's their subject, they're going to be more than happy to talk to you about it and converse with you about it. I know we are. I enjoy talking to people and hearing what they think and kind of learning from them. I think both the types of information that are passed through that conversation are valuable to each other.
Yeah, and, maybe do this very sparingly, but we have a mutual friend. We were at a conference, I recall, and there was also an astronomy conference going on, and this friend got in an elevator with some people he knew was with the astronomy conference, and he said, "Oh, so you guys are astrologers." And he just saw the life leave their eyes. It's not just us that has to do with that stuff. So, yeah. On to chapter 2, titled Epistemology, How You Know What You Know. And this is a bit more of a deep dive into science and how it works and how it's different from other ways of observing the world, I guess is the way I could put it.
Yeah, that works.
Mine starts with making the point of how an apparently simple question can actually be quite complicated.
Yeah, does yours talk about Mount Everest?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. So in this case, everyone knows Mount Everest is the tallest mountain, but tallest by what standards?
Right. How do we know this?
Right. So we measure it from its base, from sea level to its peak.
Yeah.
So it is the tallest point, but in fact, it's not the tallest mountain because the tallest mountain is in Hawaii. And if that a big chunk of its base, though, goes underwater.
Right.
So it is not the highest point, but it is a taller mountain. And so he kind of has several examples of, depending on how you are deciding tallest mountain, there are several mountains that are tallest.
Right.
And so it's a good way of taking something that seems like a very simple, straightforward question and realizing, no, this is not necessarily that easy, and how easy it is to, I think, manipulate a fact to make it seem simple.
Yeah.
I think is part of the point here too.
He makes the point to say, again, we may say Everest is the tallest mountain, but then we discover that the mountain in Hawaii is taller. That's okay.
Right.
It's okay to change your thinking and to change your observations based on what you see. That is
to
science.
add qualifiers.
Yeah.
What is the oldest city in the oldest European settlement in North America?
Oh boy, here we go, Tristan.
This is a raging debate between Pensacola and St. Augustine.
Yes.
So Pensacola can only claim the title with enough qualifiers. It is the oldest multi-year European settlement attempt in North America.
Whereas St. Augustine is the oldest continually occupied settlement in North America.
Right. And if you want to ever get someone's goat on that and they're from one of those regions, say the other one's older, and boy, it's one of my favorite things to do.
We have offices in both cities, so that's a good way to get at least two of our offices worked up.
Yeah, it's pretty easy and a lot of fun.
And we're in Tallahassee right in the middle, and we're like, we won. We became the capital.
And Tallahassee's 200 years old, so.
But he does talk about how do we know things, right? We either directly observe them through our own experiences, or we indirectly learn about them through external sources, a lot of times friends or the media or family or whatever the
Books,
case is. Yeah.
Classes. Yeah.
But he mentions, having said that, most people are poor observers. And so even firsthand information is not as great as we like to think it is.
Right. Even our own information.
Yeah.
Even our own memories and observations are usually pretty suspect.
Yeah. He goes on to talk about when you're getting secondhand information, there's questions to kind of ask yourself. Go ahead.
I was going to say his example for a poor observation from a large group of people is a pretty good one, if a little bit of a sad one. In one case, I think he said in London, there was a red panda that escaped from the zoo. And so they did an announcement on the newspaper saying, if you see it, please report it. And sadly found it dead on the train tracks not too long after it was in the newspaper, like a day ago. But for 2 weeks, they kept getting reports, thousands of reports, people had seen it.
Yeah.
And again, he has his own case where he saw an animal and he's like, that looks like a capybara. It was in a New England area. He knew it couldn't be capybara, but that's what it looked like to him. And so he had to really kind of stop and figure out what it was because it was driving him nuts.
And I feel like we all, if we really sit and think about it, we all have observations and experiences like that where I swear I saw this thing or I remember it this way. How is that not true? I know I've had conversations with my parents about something that happened in my childhood, something super mundane.
Right.
But I remember it this one way and my parents are like, absolutely not. And it makes you wonder, who is right?
Right.
Because apparently we're all horrible observers. But he has questions like when you're getting secondhand information, it forces us to rely on the quality of that information, which if you've ever played the game of telephone, you know, as information gets passed along, it usually gets further and further from the original truth. How did that person obtain that information, that whatever your source is? What are their motives? I think that is a big one. And one thing I always look at when I'm reading like an article in like a popular magazine or something, and they say this study said this, that, or the other thing, I'll go on the internet and search to see who paid for that study. That's always a big one. Like, what were their motives behind the survey?
Well, that's a primary tenet for studying historic documents, too. That's
Yeah.
not necessarily a science, but when you're looking at any historic document, you always have to keep in mind, what are the motivations for writing this document? What might influence what they're doing?
Mm-hmm.
I have seen plenty of people who have historic documents and they take them at face value. And we've even had cases where like the physical evidence says otherwise, but no, the document says this, so they're stuck on that.
Yeah. People are flawed.
Yeah.
We are flawed.
This is all kind of leading up to why the scientific process is so important.
Yeah. Like you said, what is the source? Right. And then also, how expert, as you mentioned before, how expert are they on the topic? So that definitely plays a role. Again, he talks about how people mostly obtain their information. Like I said, it mentions everything like but the internet.
Well, that's interesting because in mine, it very specifically talks about a move away from traditional information sources and towards social media as our primary news source is a major problem.
Oh, yes, it is.
Although I would argue that kind of a lot of newspapers are not helping themselves in this situation either, because as we've experienced firsthand through our work, that a lack of investigative journalism sometimes is frustrating.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because he actually talks a little bit about newspapers in mine, and he talks about how they're not all created equally. And a lot of people, I guess, during, you know, the early 2000s kind of took tabloids. A lot of tabloids kind of made themselves appear to be like news sources. Even though he compares to the New York Times, which even today is a pretty good source of information. Not always perfect, but about as good as you can get. And then something that I've never heard of, but I've never been a huge tabloid person either, called the Weekly World News. It talks about their taglines, I guess. The New York Times was all the news that is fit to print, where the Weekly World News, their editor is quoted as saying, "For heaven's sake, we entertain people. We make people feel better." And then in small print on every issue, it states that they use multiple sources and most are fictitious, but it's in really small print.
Right.
But a lot of people at the time were taking that to be like a reputable source of news. So this was an issue even before the internet was widely used as a news source.
It's just the scale has gotten different. And I remember jokes about that. I'm thinking specifically Men in Black, the first one.
Yeah.
Because they're like, the best source for news on alien happenings is to go to the tabloids.
Right.
And it was presented as just a silly joke, but people took that seriously. And that's the reason it was meant to be funny. Because they're like, oh, look, it actually is useful. Ha ha. You know? Yeah.
Does he mention like some of the anthropology type stories that are popular in tabloids at all?
No, well, he didn't talk about tabloids at all.
Oh my gosh. It's funny because he uses terminology that we not necessarily like to use anymore, but aliens and ape men are one. And then the wacky savages, which I don't like. I personally don't like the term savages, but I can see it being in tabloids. And then the wacky anthropologists. And I'm like, oh, that's why everybody thinks we're supposed to be quirky and weird.
That might be the most accurate, potentially.
Then silly studies. Essentially, like, this is being highly critical of how tax money is being spent on silly and frivolous studies by those wacky anthropologists. You know, like, why are they studying this? What is the point? You know, and we get that a lot too, even today. Like, why are we studying this? But I think now people are coming to realize, and maybe this is because kind of live in this world, but anthropology and archaeology has some really good applications that might not be obvious to the everyday person.
That some of that is a shift in the discipline as well.
Yeah. Oh, because, definitely.
You know, it's becoming much less ivory tower and much more about how can what I'm working on have a positive impact on the community this is researching.
Yeah. Yeah. How can we solve modern day problems? How can we help communities that are struggling with certain things or, you know, interested in certain things? But I just thought that was interesting because because he's really big on the tabloids in my book, which is
No,
non-existent in
non-existent.
yours.
No, it's all about, well, he doesn't even talk about social media that much. But yeah, all this, I think, is building into what the point of science is.
Yes.
Right? Because science helps us kind of navigate all of this. Science gives us a process of testing ideas and seeing what is real and what is not. Well, is that a good way of phrasing it?
I think so. He mentions in my book, like, science doesn't make a claim to have all of the answers or be right all of the time. It's actually often wrong, but
Yes.
it's a way to kind of start.
I think this is his phrasing. It helps us maximize the probability of correct information.
Yes. That is superb.
Right, which doesn't mean it's always correct, but it helps us get to the point where most of it should be.
Yeah, and eventually, like, it just kind of weeds through all the misinformation to get at the facts, and eventually it leads you to the truth, I guess you would say.
And it's not about always knowing everything, and importantly, being wrong is a part of the process, right?
Yeah.
And that comes down to a lot of the arguments I've seen against science is like, look at all the times they're wrong. Like, that's a part of it.
Right.
You have to be wrong to figure it out first time in science. Well, not first time, but eventually in science.
Yeah. Did your book talk at all about how the media portrays scientists?
Yes, I think that was a little earlier.
Okay. Because in mine, he talks about how, like, the media often portrays scientists as, like, a white male, kind of eccentric. Think like Doc Brown in Back to the Future.
Great Scott.
Right. I know
Right.
we're probably, like, aging ourselves now. And if it's a female scientist, it's usually kind of like this, like, shy, book smart, thick glasses, hair in a tight bun kind of thing.
I'm picturing at least one James Bond, probably most of the James Bond female scientists, actually.
But I feel like that's changing now. I just watched a show or a movie on Netflix, and the scientist was like this hip, cool chick, and so it is interesting to see how that has changed. I don't think it's been super dramatic, but it will be interesting in the future to see if that changes too. And this was also like a sci-fi, so
I can think of a number of very unique female scientist characters, at least a few off the top of my head. But yeah, it has changed.
Yeah, his point was like, scientists are not like these misfits or like megalomaniacs that are just obsessed with their one theory or their one thing to the point where it's not healthy and to where it's detrimental to the discipline as a whole. Like
well, I'm sure it happens, but that's not good science.
Right? Yeah.
That's not people doing good work.
We're just people that are interested in a subject, and we're using the scientific method to try and extrapolate the truth.
Yeah.
We have other hobbies too. We're not Doc Brown.
Again, I think most of us do.
Right, yeah.
I can think of a couple that don't.
Right.
But that's not healthy. Does he talk about the rules of science, the principles of science in yours?
Yes, he does.
So there are several principles of science that he lays out. There is a real and noble universe.
Mm-hmm.
The universe operates according to a certain understandable rule or law.
Mm-hmm.
Rules or laws. These laws are immutable. These laws can be discerned, studied, and understood by people through careful observation, experimentation, and research.
Yes.
And he goes into each one a little bit more.
Yeah, one thing that I just wanted to point out was under the first rule that there is a real and knowable universe. He talks about the deconstructionists.
Mhm.
Does he talk about that in yours?
Yeah.
And how they undermine, I guess, science.
They undermine everything. Frankly.
Yeah.
I have a direct quote from him here.
Okay, perfect.
This is not a useful approach for human beings. Science simply is not the same as myth. Science demands a rigorous testing and retesting, and it commonly rejects and discards previous conclusions about the world as a result of such testing. The same cannot be said for non-scientific explanations about how things work. And that's pretty well what it is and why it's different from other ways of knowing how the universe or world works.
Nice.
For the laws are immutable rule, he uses gravity as a good example. It behaves as a constant. Using the apple falling from a tree, it's always going to fall at the same rate.
Right.
That's a good one. A good saying, like, once you kind of get to some of those roots, they're not going to change on you. Although it could. And then that's an exciting and fascinating question if it does. Actually, if we can go into popular media just a little bit, there's a free body problem.
Oh,
It's a
yeah.
very popular thing right now. If you haven't seen it and don't want spoilers, skip ahead a few seconds. I'm not going to go into too much detail. So the premise is that physicists are discovering that everything they think they knew about physics is not true. And some of them are so distraught, they're killing themselves over it. And it's like, that's terrible science. The fact that everything you thought was untrue should be exciting.
Yeah, it's a new problem to solve.
It's a whole world of new problems. Like, that's so exciting. An example in archaeology that has me excited, and it's kind of a hot topic right now, and I'm not sure what way it's leaning at the moment, is the peopling of North America. When people came to North America for the first time. You may have heard about the land bridge. Well, there is growing evidence that people may have been here before that, which is exciting because how did they get here?
Right.
What was the process that happened? I think they're still working on all of those questions, but that's potentially very exciting information, and it will change a lot. And that I love that. You had one more?
Yeah, so I just wanted to talk about like law number 4, which is that the laws can be understood. Science is complicated, right? But it has to make sense, even if it's complicated. And he talks about induction and deduction. So like either arguing from specifics to generalities or from generalities to specifics. And then he goes into like how science is objective and unbiased. I mean, of course, we're human and we make mistakes. And sometimes, I think he mentioned somewhere in here how scientists admit that at some point in their career, a lot of them have recognized bias in their research, but they recognize it, which I think is really important to say, okay, whoops,
right.
Let me go back and redo that because I see where my judgment was clouded based on my own life experiences or whatever the case may be. So I think recognizing that is important because it would be silly to say, oh no, I'm completely unbiased, because that's impossible. But he talks a little bit about like what a hypothesis is, and even when we cannot directly observe something, we can essentially still test it, like history, right? We can't observe history, but there's certain things that through studying, in our case, numerous archaeological sites, patterns develop, and we start to deduce things from those patterns about the past, even though we can't jump in like a time capsule and hop back 2,000 years and see it for ourselves. Like carbon dating, for example, I've had people ask me, well, how do you know that's true? We can't live that long. Or how do we know that things are changing in the climate? We haven't been around that long. And there are ways to test that. I think it's important for people to understand that.
Yeah, it is a lot of evidence actually built up around these things.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what he gets down to at some point, is the overwhelming amount of evidence is what this is based on. It's not based off of flimsy stuff.
Right, yeah.
Kind of a good illustration of a lot of this is he goes into a case study about the childbed fever. I want to give a little bit of a warning on this one. We're not going to get too graphic, we don't do that, but it isn't very pleasant. It can be a little uncomfortable with childbirth and a lot of illness and death and that kind of thing. So just be aware of that. If you feel like you need to skip past it, skip ahead a few minutes and just be aware. So do you want to lead this one or shall I?
Sure, I can start.
Kind of one of your subjects a little bit, I know. So
yeah. So I give a tour of a local cemetery, and I talk a little bit about this in my tour. But in the 19th century, women started giving birth in hospitals, and it was mostly like the wealthier women because it costs a little more. But it was actually in my book, it quotes that it was one scientist said that it was safer to give birth in a street alley on the way to the hospital than in a 19th century hospital. Home births actually had a lower maternal death rate. So the mother was dying a lot less. And so childbed fever, what they were finding was shortly after they gave birth, they started running a fever, essentially an infection. A lot of them passed away, and they couldn't really figure it out.
Remember, this was before they had germ theory.
Exactly.
They can't observe the thing that's causing it, which is important.
There was everything hypothesized from tight petticoats early in pregnancy, but that doesn't really work because it was only hospital-bound women that were dying at this rate. Foul hospital air, which I was like, okay, we're getting kind of close.
Right.
Magnetic and atmospheric disturbances, blocked milk ducts. Women were embarrassed essentially to death by male doctors. And then also one explanation they had was like the fear of the hospital, which is kind of like
the fear of the childbed fever.
Which is like this weird circular logic that doesn't really work because I mean, obviously there was this fear, but it couldn't have been the reason for the death. That doesn't track. But there was this hospital in Vienna that had essentially 2 birthing wards, and a doctor kind of took this as an opportunity to solve the issue because you essentially had 2 different laboratories, right?
Well, and one of them was monstrously high
Yeah,
death
yeah.
rates.
One of the wards had a much, much higher mortality rate than the other. And so he wanted to see what one was doing different than the other, or what conditions were different in one versus the other that would possibly explain the high mortality rate. And I thought this was interesting because at this point, the author talks about creativity and imagination in science. And this is something we don't necessarily think of. We always think right brain, left brain, blah, blah, blah. But in science, just being able to think of the problem and say, okay, there is this problem. What might be the issue? You kind of start the process of thinking like, why?
Coming up with possible things is a very creative process.
Yeah.
In mine, he used Isaac Newton's and the apple as a good example.
Yeah.
You know, how many people had seen apples fall from trees?
And just never really thought anything about it.
And thought about why.
Yeah.
And then also taking that next step and trying to come up with possible explanations for why.
Yeah. So there is a certain level of creativity and imagination that plays a really important role in science, because it's just that initial step of asking yourself, seeing something and asking why, and then trying to come up with like plausible reasons. So you have to keep in mind, like Tristan said, viruses and bacteria were unknown, and this was in like the 1840s. So what he ended up realizing was like there was the groups of nurses or the ward that had the higher rate of mortality. The nurses that were doing the birthing and things there, they were also doing autopsies of women who had died.
If we can take a step back, because you might have wanted to shorten this, but I feel like it's important, is he had a number of hypotheses he tested first.
Yeah,
right?
He did. And
he observed that the ward with more overcrowding had higher mortality, so maybe overcrowding was the problem. Birth positions were different from one to the next, so that was maybe the problem. And so he had a series of 4, and he tested each of them methodically, and none of them had a difference. So he's coming up with possible explanations, he's finding ways of testing them, and he is dismissing them when the evidence doesn't allow itself. And importantly, he gets to the last one, he doesn't say, all the rest of them are untrue, so it must be this one.
Right. He tests that one as well.
Tests that one true,
Yeah.
and he also finds that is not the answer.
Right. So yeah, he has to kind of go back to the drawing board, which happens in science all the time.
That's
and
science
often
working.
Yeah. He realizes one of the differences the medical staff in this one ward that has the higher mortality is conducting autopsies of the women that have died. Then they were going back into the ward and helping women deliver babies. They weren't washing their hands. They weren't, sanitizing or sterilizing any of the materials they used.
Did he talk about what led to this observation in the first place? He had a doctor he knew that during an autopsy cut himself and then died of childbed fever.
Oh.
And that was the impetus for like, oh wait, maybe there's something in the bodies that
he called it cadaveric material.
Yeah.
Because, if a male doctor dies of this same illness that's killing these women, obviously it's not the birthing process itself, right? It's something else that's going on. So he realizes that it's what he calls this cadaveric material, because remember, we don't have germ theory yet.
Yeah, no concept of that.
But what's really interesting is like he solved this issue before knowing about germ theory. He had them sterilize, wash their hands, and do all that kind of stuff. And what I found interesting too is in trying to solve the mystery by performing these autopsies on these women that had passed away, they were actually making the disease spread, right? There had to be a break in that chain, which was the sterilizing and the hand washing and things like that. And I don't have the statistics in front of me.
I do. The ward that was better before treatment had 200 deaths in 10,000. After treatment, it had 130 in 10,000. The ward that was not doing well, 2,000 in 10,000 at first. So 1 in 5 women were dying of this disease. Afterwards, it was 120 in 10,000.
Goodness.
That's a massive difference.
Yeah. I thought it was cool because using the scientific process without even having any understanding of viruses
and
or
not
germs.
being able to see them, right?
Yeah, and not being able to see them, but using this process, he was able to cut down on the rate of death in this ward. And to me, like that is really strong evidence of how well the scientific process works when utilized correctly.
Right.
Does he talk about Occam's razor?
He does. Before we do that, though, he talks a bit about comparing science to non-science and what some of the differences are. And basically, for something to be scientific, it has to be testable. And so an example he provides is the idea of people who are psychic, and that psychic effect disappears as soon as you try to test it. And he's like, well, then that's not scientific and we can't test it.
I remember reading how some people who believe in these psychic abilities have created like a effect. Is that what the psychic effect is? Like people, oh, well, yeah, of course you can't test it because of the psychic effect or
Right,
whatever.
the shyness effect.
Yeah. Okay. Shyness effect.
That's what it was. Yeah, which is just suspect to me because that is so convenient to you're holding on to what you were thinking. Yeah. He also, in the hospital case, we said he didn't go with the process of elimination. He tested all of the hypotheses. He didn't just eliminate the first three and said the fourth one must be it. And he said this is a common pattern we see with UFO stuff.
Oh.
It's not a weather balloon, it's not a plane, then it must be an alien.
Right.
Right. And that's not how it's supposed to be working. That's why the scientific process doesn't accept aliens.
Right.
Oh yeah, but then you talked about Occam Razor.
Yeah, he talks a little bit about it. And I know it's a phrase that's used in the TV show Bones and a couple other TV shows. And sometimes
Heard it in quite a bit in the movie Contact.
I don't remember that movie.
It's a good movie. I recommend it.
But, let me see if I can describe Occam's razor. But it like essentially leads you to bet on the more likely possibility.
The way it's kind of officially defined is that the hypothesis that explains a series of observations with the fewest other assumptions or leaps is the best explanation.
Yeah.
And then he takes a few times to kind of break that down and what it means. I like the example. Apparently there was a doctor who had medical students who were new and they would give wild out of left field diagnoses for simple issues people were having. And he finally told them, when you hear hoofbeats, think of horses, not zebras.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a good way of putting it, right? Which is the most likely? Start with that.
Yep.
And if that doesn't hold up, then you have to go maybe check out zebras or probably a donkey first or something,
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah. And he talks about dinosaur bones. Does he talk about the dinosaur bones and how some people believe they were put there by the devil?
No. Go ahead and do that one. I'll do the one he's got in mind.
So there were people who apparently
Still are.
Yeah, believed that dinosaur bones were put in the earth by the devil, or extinct animal bones, I guess. Again,
to fool us into believing in something other than God's word, I think is kind of how the argument would be phrased.
Yeah. But he's using this as an example of okay, you have bones of something, animals die.
Right.
So there's too many questions. Okay, how did the devil put them there? Even why did the devil put them there? Because there were a multitude of reasons that people had. And there's just a lot of questions, whereas it's this is an animal that had died that has a lot less assumptions attached to it. It might be an animal that we don't have anymore, but could it be from an extinct animal that no longer exists? And there's just a lot of Occam's razor. It's just the most obvious answer is probably the answer. It might not be the answer you like. And this is where religion and what you want to be true, making what you want to be true kind of comes in to explain, there's different biases.
Mm-hmm.
Religion in this case was a huge one because if dinosaurs exist, that might challenge. People took the Bible extremely literally. And so it would challenge their whole kind of belief system.
Or they perceived it that way.
Right.
That doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but people tend to rather perceive it as a challenge rather than change their belief system.
Right. And the belief system was just very rigid and very...
Yeah. A similar story in mine, if I can
go ahead.
With that, is he's, instead of doing dinosaur bones or extinct animal bones, he is talking about stone tools and how this was a similar problem because stone tools didn't fit the narrative presented in the Bible. In the Bible, people are using metal tools, bronze or copper, that kind of thing. They're probably the earliest, but they're not using stone arrowheads, stone axes. And so for similar reasons, because it didn't fit their assumptions of how the world should work, people came up with all kinds of explanations for them, including tales of fairies making them. And even they're all made by lightning strikes on rocks. Even though no one's ever observed a fairy, or despite, lightning striking rocks and people going to look and never seeing anything remotely like this. And so that basically they're jumping through all these hoops to try and find explanations when the most simple answer is simply humans made it. And that's what we've settled on now, finally. So interesting that he's changed his narrative there a little bit. Probably changed it to be a little more archaeological.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
And so this ties into what he brings up next, which is confirmation bias. And this is something I think we all all fall prey to really badly, especially with social media and memes. We see a thing and we are likely to engage with things that reinforce our assumptions on information we already think is true. And that's a big problem, and there's not an easy answer about that. There's whole discussions about how do we even train ourselves to avoid it, and I don't think there is a good answer on that yet. Basically, people tend to take the information that confirms what they already think. Actually, this ties into one of my favorite authors, Terry Pratchett, and he has a book titled The Truth. In this narrative, it's this society developing newspapers for the first time. And one of the things one of the characters points out is that people don't really want news, they want olds, which I thought was clever because in this case, the newspaper who's trying earnestly to report actual things happening is already dealing with tabloids undermining everything they're trying to do. But the tabloids are reinforcing what people already think is true. And was a fantastic observation on this phenomena, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. In mine, he talks about like how science doesn't remain static, and you have new ideas that might initially be rejected because of lack of evidence, but then the evidence appears, and sometimes that takes a while, and eventually these what were new ideas that were rejected become like the most logical explanation for something based on new evidence. Like in science, like we keep the hypotheses that haven't been disproved, right? But once they have been disproved, we need to move on to a new hypothesis. He talks about how science grows and expands based on new evidence, and then he mentions a little bit about how archaeological data is often misused to prove an idea or claim that is nowhere near being correct because they didn't use the scientific process. And oftentimes, especially in the media, it's someone with very little understanding of archaeology and the scientific process. So one thing he was talking about was like, look at who's writing it. Like we said before, are they an expert in this area?
Right.
And even if they're not an expert in this area, one thing I think to add is who did they consult, right? Because you don't necessarily have to be an expert in something to write about it, but who did you consult? Like when we talked to Mariana Evans in our interview, she consulted with an archaeologist. She's not an archaeologist, but she consulted with one.
And she consulted via books by archaeologists.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah. But I mean, you're right in the fact that like media, especially today.
And not all of it's made equally.
Yeah.
It is a growing problem, it seems like.
Yeah. And it's really, really important to be able to discern what is good and what is bad. And you know what? If you want to read the bad stuff, go for it, but recognize what it is.
Does he talk about the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence argument in yours? I thought that was interesting.
Not really, no.
He points that out as an argument that people make who believe in these conspiracy theories. And his response was fair enough, generally speaking anyway. But he points out that this is usually a last-ditch argument. When everything else has been shown to be untrue, they throw that out. But he points out how society could not function if we operated this way. His example is, I don't own the car title. That doesn't mean I can't still sell it to you. And basically, just everything would break down if that's how we operated. So we can't function under that argument. And so that argument essentially is not a valid argument.
Right.
Is what it comes to.
Interesting.
He gets a little more specific with his example that I liked because there are cases where it can apply. So like if you say there is a specific atom in this room with you, you can look high and low, but your chances of finding that single atom in a room is almost impossible. So in that case, it may be a matter of absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Say that right? I have trouble saying that one. Yes. But if you compare that to saying there's a velociraptor in the room with you, you can look around, you can spend months turning everything over, and once you've fully looked through the whole room and you found no giant murderous dinosaur in the room with you, you can reasonably say that absence of evidence means that it is not here.
He does not go into that much detail, but one quote when he was talking about that topic that I really liked was, and this is a quote from the book, "Certainty in science is a scarce commodity." And I was like, I love that, because so many people take science as something that's concrete and certain, and
when we don't very often prove a thing.
Right, exactly.
We fail to reject a thing.
Exactly.
That's how it's usually phrased when you read actual science.
Yeah.
So that's one reason if you ever see a headline, you see the word prove, you know it's misleading you, frankly.
Yeah. And a lot of times something I've noticed with like the media, and we've dealt with this recently, is the journalist or the writer is trying to come up with a catchy title to lure in the reader, right? And so you might read that in the title, still read the article, but question the article.
Yeah, don't take it at face value.
Yeah.
Definitely don't take the headline at face value.
Oh my
That's the
gosh.
real problem, I
Yeah.
feel like, a lot of times.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times you get into that article and it's like, well, that's not what the headline says at all.
Right. They just wanted you to read it, and
Right,
it
and
worked.
it worked, dang it. Yeah, and look at the ads. He does have a very good conversation, I think, too, about how skeptics are not cynics, and there is a difference between the two. So skeptics are never really wrong in the sense that it's wrong to be skeptical and until convincing irrefutable evidence. So they're not denying the thing, they are asking questions about the thing.
Oh, that's interesting. He doesn't really go into that in my
Yeah.
book.
Contrary, he shows, is cynics, despite overwhelming amount of evidence, they are denying the thing exists. And that's an important differentiation, even though it's not necessarily how the common language, I feel, works, because skeptics is used for cynics, basically.
Yeah.
And
No,
people
because
claim to be skeptical when they're actually cynics.
yeah. Well, and I've been told I'm being cynical when I'm just being skeptical.
Yeah.
I'm asking too many questions.
Yeah, and so being a skeptic is a part of being science.
Right.
Asking questions, testing ideas.
Wanting to see evidence.
In a lovely turn, he actually uses Crystal River, Florida as an example.
Really?
Yes.
Oh.
So that is actually right close to us, and we actually have an office located at this park. So it was very exciting. So in this case, there were excavations in the 1940s that found, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, Stela? Stelae?
Stella, maybe?
Yeah, I'm not really sure, but this was a pillar with some carving in it with some like offerings that had been left for it, apparently. And it was interesting because this reflected or is very similar to some things they see in Mayan culture. And so the initial hypothesis was that this site may have had some direct interaction with Mayan culture, which is a fascinating idea. However, they tested it very thoroughly. Archaeologists were skeptical of this claim because they're testing it. There were no artifacts that were sourced to the Mayan area. There were no other hieroglyphs. There were no Mayan-style burials. So essentially, there was nothing that would connect this group to the Mayans except for this one thing. And since then, there have been many more investigations and nothing similar has been found. If information was found, then the skeptics would be willing to take that into account and start changing their perspective and testing the idea even further. So this is a good example of something we see a lot. I hear this with there's one, I won't go into this here, we might talk about it later in the book even, the Solutrean hypothesis.
Yeah. Pretty cool that he mentions Crystal River though. One thing I'm noticing in the two editions is he has a lot more examples in your book than he does in mine.
He's got a healthy amount of examples in this edition, I would say.
Yeah, which is cool. More evidence.
Since we're talking about good examples and going back, if I can go back to the idea you were talking about before about how scientists aren't perfect, they make mistakes. He has a good example about how quality argument is the only thing that should matter, but sometimes the reputation of the scientist can overweigh that. In this case, he points out that there was questions about meteors, and some people were hypothesizing that these were objects that were coming from outer space.
Oh yeah, that example is in my book.
Okay. I liked it because Isaac Newton roundly rejected the idea.
Yeah.
And because he did, everyone mostly fell in line except for a few who were ridiculed for a long time.
Yeah.
But again, importantly, here's where you saw science is self-correcting, I think, at least in my version is where he put that, because eventually they found meteors, they tested the alloys and found that the alloys did not exist on Earth.
Yeah.
When the evidence started to mount that, no, this is actually how things work, then it changed.
Yeah.
And it isn't always as quick as we might want it to.
But yeah, in the reputation of this scientist, when we as scientists revere someone, when they say something, it does hold a little bit more weight. And that's not necessarily how it should be. And it's okay to recognize okay, this person is a very well-known, renowned scientist, but again, they are just human.
Right.
And that kind of plays into our next chapter a little bit.
Before we go, though, we've ended on a really good note in my version, which I bet you don't have.
Okay.
He brings up the show Legends Legends of the Lost, which I only vaguely recalled, but it came back to me as he was talking. Do you recall this show at all?
I mean, I not off the title alone, no.
It was produced and hosted by Megan Fox.
What?
And what's the phrasing? It's going to look at age-old mysteries that still perplex scientists and archaeologists to this day. And so him in the book, he's like, okay, let's give it a chance and have a look at it. And maybe she's going to have a very cool take on this and really good hard look at some of these things and find, that some of them are not true or are true in this case. But there were a few warning signs. In particular, she said she was a huge fan of Ancient Aliens.
Oh, no.
Right. She said in an interview, her qualifications for doing the show basically are that she's unqualified to do the show. So let me find her exact phrasing because that is important, because that's my interpretation of what she said. I haven't spent my entire life building a career in academia, so I don't have to worry about my reputation or being rebuked by my colleagues, which allows me to push back on the status quo. So much of our history needs to be re-examined.
Well, that's problematic.
Right. And that brings in the whole, kind of sums up a lot of what he talked about in this chapter about the value of expertise and the value of questioning and testing things. And so it basically went poorly, which is thankful. But he uses as a contrast one of the best shows and illustrations of the scientific process, Mythbusters.
Oh, yeah. That's a great show.
That is a great show. And he points out they have this myth and they create hypotheses for it. They figure out ways to test it, and then they adjust the test if they need to.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end, they decide that it's either plausible or debunked.
Yeah.
They don't say it's true. They say it's plausible. It's plausible.
Yeah.
Or in more scientific speak, they failed to prove it untrue, basically.
Yeah. Oh, I love that show. I used to binge watch that show.
Yes. It was a very good, strong way of ending that chapter, I felt.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I mean, as a scientist, it can be very frustrating that there's this idea that because you are a scientist, you have more biases or, you're more invested in it and that's problematic rather than valued. It's very strange. I understand why some people can feel that way. Like they might feel we have our own agenda or like Megan Fox says, we have our reputation built on this certain thing, but it's
By
not
large,
like
it's
that.
Not. If someone does guarantee you there's someone pushing back and challenging that.
Right.
Still.
Yeah.
Because
so
that's how it works. And frankly, you can make a reputation doing that.
Right.
And
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
people who did that are some of the most famous archaeologists quite often.
Yeah.
In archaeology, I'm thinking specifically like Louis Binford. He was such a proponent in changing archaeology and the direction archaeology goes. We talked about him a little bit at the beginning of Small Things Forgotten.
Yes.
But basically, he was one of the big proponents and the big pushes for we can use math to help us understand trends in artifacts.
Yeah.
And that was a completely new concept.
Yeah. But yeah, so it's just perplexing to me that
and frustrating.
But, I'm trying to see both sides of the coin. I can see why people think that way, but I hope that maybe through our podcast, they can start to understand that it's not that way at all.
Yeah.
And it shouldn't be that way. And if there is a scientist who is not open to other hypotheses or not willing to look at other evidence that may not fit with their hypothesis, they're not doing science.
And again, it is self-correcting.
Yeah.
That person may be popular for a while, they may be believed for a while, but eventually they will start to be challenged. And again, we'll see again and again, actually, the next two examples.
Yes, I was just going to say.
People doing this exact thing and challenging these things.
So that being said, you want to start chapter 3?
Yeah, it's a good segue,
yes.
I would say, right?
So chapter 3 is Anatomy of an Archaeological Hoax, which I just love the title of this chapter.
Giants! Exclamation point, yeah.
Well, this is interesting too because Fujimura, who is the main character, the topic, of this chapter, him and his hoax are the topic of this chapter. He wasn't an archaeologist; he was an amateur.
That's the next one.
What?
That's for the ancient human.
Oh, my chapter starts out with Fujimura. Chapter 3.
Go ahead and talk about it. I don't think I've got that.
Oh my gosh.
All right.
Okay.
So Barbara and I had to have a little meeting because, like we talked about, we're dealing with different versions. There's a whole section in Barbara's chapter that I don't have. Mine is all about the giant hoax, but she has some other example mixed in with her one
Yeah.
about. You have giants too, though, you said.
I do, yes. But it
Okay.
starts out with Fujimura, who was an amateur archaeologist, meaning he had no academic training, but he was very well known and well respected in Japan. And one of the things the author talks about when he's talking about things not to do when you're creating a hoax is don't look like you're too lucky, because that breeds skepticism and jealousy. And Fujimura was essentially, he was finding all this stuff that was rewriting Japanese prehistory. And people were like, oh, you know, this guy's great. Everywhere he goes, he finds this new information that's just rewriting our history, leading also into like this sense of nationalist pride, right? Other archaeologists were very skeptical of this. How is it this guy is always finding this stuff? The author talks about how appearing too lucky can lead to skepticism and jealousy. And I think the reason he's talking about this is because, well, this happens in other hoaxes throughout the history of archaeological hoaxes. But this guy was caught literally red-handed thanks to hidden cameras. Someone who was very skeptical of him put a hidden camera at one of the sites he had been working at. After he announced this big discovery, the camera footage was released. And it was just his complete downfall, right? And the issue was, not only does this do damage to the discipline, but also the trust in our discipline and trust in science in general. But what about all these other sites he's worked on? What's true? What's false? And in my mind, I was kind of thinking about crime scene investigation. Like, say you had a detective who was found out to be planting evidence or something like that to get convictions. Then how do you know that detective didn't do that at other sites as well? And this amateur archaeologist, he did eventually confess, and it was found out that he had corrupted 42 sites that he had worked on. And overall, he had worked on 180 sites. So those are like 42 that they know about.
Right, for
but
sure.
there's potentially 180 sites that...
all of them are suspect now.
Yeah. And so this...
Interesting.
He talks about how this was a combination of, like, you know, fame. He was becoming famous, well-known, well-respected, nationalism, right? Getting that sense of, you know, nationalistic pride and Japanese prehistory. Everybody was talking about it. Everybody had an interest in it. It wasn't really about money, which is another one that kind of can be a main factor in somebody doing these kind of hoaxes. But the author talks about this very briefly, just to, I guess, as an example, a modern example of like the damage it does to the discipline and how it's hard to get away with it these days, but not impossible, because other scientists, other archaeologists respected him, and he got away with it for 42 sites, you know, before he was caught. So even scientists can get caught up in this. And then the author starts going on to Cardiff Man, talking about that hoax. And
so, yeah, if I can jump
go
in
ahead.
before we go, because mine probably starts a little different, because he starts in mine laying out the ancient giants myth, the idea that there were ancient giants. Typically, my Cliff's Notes version of the arguments are they're Nephilim or something, and Nephilim are supposed to be a angel-human hybrid. They were giant beings. There is archaeological evidence of skeletons. They had double rows of teeth, and the Smithsonian is hiding the evidence, is kind of what it comes down to. That's why we don't have it. And so he talks about why the myth exists in the first place, which is very reasonable. People long time ago, without context for what they're looking at, found giant animal bones of mammoth and dinosaurs and whatever. And that was the explanation that made sense to them at the time.
Does he talk about the Bible, the mentioning of different giants within biblical context?
He does in brief. He doesn't go into much detail about it, just saying it is mentioned, particularly with Goliath.
Yeah.
Particularly sections about talking about Goliath. There's another thing that when connective tissue decays on a body, the bones can actually spread out a little bit, and that makes them look taller than they would have been. Finally, the whole double rows of teeth thing, he says, is actually slang for a previous period that just means the person had very healthy teeth. So, like, they had double row teeth, so they had an extra set of teeth. That's why their teeth look so nice. It's just slang for that. And so he says all these things are very have a lot of evidence that that's where they came from. And so then we apply Occam's razor, and what is the best answer? We have no bones that anyone can show us today. So there are two possible explanations. One is that centuries-long conspiracy that a huge number of humans kept the secret, which doesn't seem that likely, as we talked about, or there are simply no bones and they didn't exist. And that is the more likely of the two explanations with the evidence we have presented to us right now.
Interesting.
And then we move full on into the Cardiff Giant.
I love these kind of things because they're goofy to me now. Like,
they're hoaxes, but they're almost fascinating from an archaeological and cultural perspective anyway.
Yeah. And as we learn later in this chapter, like there's like museum displays and plenty of like academic works on
You can go still see the Cardiff Giant. Yeah. So 1869, a farmer having some workers dig for a well comes across a giant stone body, basically. And he's very quick to capitalize on this and starts charging people almost immediately to come view it. And it was a huge cultural phenomenon. Like they said 300 to 500 people a day came.
Yeah. This happened all really fast. Like I was surprised, especially in that day and age, how many people would have learned about it. You didn't have
and I could see it going pretty quick, especially when it's very sensational like this.
Yeah, but for people to like drop everything and go see this thing from all around the country.
They said they had thousands of people come.
Yeah, and I guess, it became this economic kind of situation, essentially tourism like popped up around it. You had hotels, you had carriage houses, everything, all these other businesses kind of popped up around it because of it. And of course that led people to want to invest in it.
Right, which they did. Large amounts of money. They estimated, what was it, like at least $500,000 into it. P.T. Barnum showed up and wanted to buy it.
Right.
Or hire it for a while at least. They refused, which I love that story. We'll come back to that. All this popularity and fervor, and it's very clear part of the reason it caught on so much is because it confirmed the Bible.
Yeah.
And that confirmed people's beliefs about how things were, and they wanted that to happen. It's about olds, not news, right? Some hints of problems started to show up. Some people reported seeing a wagon carrying a heavy cargo about a year ago. The landowner was possibly bragging about defrauding people. And then professional scientists, geologists, paleontologists, and artists, basically everyone who saw it who was a professional of some level said it was a fraud.
Right.
Even like artists and stuff could tell it was not real. Initial thought wasn't necessarily that it was a hoax. They thought maybe it was a statue from Jesuits, which is a reasonable hypothesis.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because, you wouldn't expect someone to create this elaborate hoax. So your first line of thinking is like, okay, what's another explanation that...
And we'll see that in the next one too.
Yeah.
But some people noticed fresh plant material mixed in with the soil, that's a pretty good giveaway. They also observed that it was carved from gypsum, and understanding the weathering of gypsum and everything, someone guessed that it was about a year it had been buried, and it turned out to be very accurate.
Yeah, which is also in line with when someone remembers some really heavy cartload coming in. So everything kind of like started to line up as far as...
Oh, and then others observed that weathering had obscured it a bit, but there were still signs of tool marks and polished surfaces on it too, which is also like,
Yeah.
And interestingly, this became strong enough that even newspapers started to change their stories and start to question it and put doubt on it. But none of it seemed to have much of an effect on public opinion.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is, that's the ancient aliens thing all over again,
Yeah,
right?
I was thinking when I was reading this, like, okay, this still happens.
Yep.
Just in a different context. Like the scientists could be saying one thing and everybody could be saying, oh no, this isn't real. But if you read it on the internet, it must be true.
So eventually, someone about 40 years later who was involved confessed to faking it. He was an atheist, which is no coincidence. And essentially, the whole thing that prompted this was he had an argument with a minister about the literal truth of the Bible.
Yeah.
And he's like, well, I'm just going to go and make my own truth and we'll see if people accept it, I think is what through his head. And so they went into great details about how they made it. So basically, he hired an artist to carve it. And I love this. The artist who, as we would say in, I think, modern memes, didn't understand the assignment, carved it in Pole's likeness.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Which is fantastic. And so he made him like remove the beard, and then he went through with like a board with
Needles.
nails and like
Yeah.
damage the surface, and then used acid to age it and wear away the tool marks a
Yeah.
bunch, and then left it to lie in the ground for a year.
When I was reading this and I realized that it was someone who was in an argument with a minister and was trying to make a point.
Or a prophet. I'm not sure where his motivation fully lied.
It kind of made me sad because I felt like he was taking advantage of people and their beliefs, and I don't like that.
No, it wasn't. Wasn't a nice move
The
at all.
motive was just really sour, and it didn't sit
ugly.
well.
It was just straight up ugly.
Yeah.
All of this, the confession in particular, and all the detail about how it was faked finally ended the popularity of it. He almost adds this as an aside because he's got to enjoy it, not because it matters to the points he's trying to make. But P.T. Barnum, who wanted to buy it, went and made his own fake.
I know.
So it was a fake of a fake.
Yeah.
But he billed it as a real one, and there were many lawsuits, and at some point even, apparently the fake of the fake drew more viewers than the original fake.
Right. It is interesting. I think it's a good example, though, of how these hoaxes can kind of reach like mythological proportions and be an attraction themselves. And that's
kind of why I want to go see it, actually.
I know. Yeah, it's still on display. You can go see this fake.
I kind of want to.
Yeah. And
the fake and the fake of the fake. And as we see later, the fake of the fake of the fake.
Yeah.
Because there is a third one.
It goes to show how these fakes and these hoaxes kind of become part of our history too, and our like human story, which I think is kind of weird and interesting. And yeah, like you said, I really want to go see it. I think it's on display at the Farmers Museum in Cooperstown, New York.
It says somewhere in here, I forget exactly, but I love apparently there was like a whole bunch of satire that cropped up around this. Like there's a poem about the Cardiff Giant, and apparently Mark Twain was so amused by it that his story, The Ghost Story, is inspired by it. I love this.
Yeah.
So in this case,
all this cultural stuff like popped up surrounding it even after they knew it was a fake.
Yeah, the ghost is haunting a hotel because his fossilized body is so cruelly displayed in the exhibit hall nearby, and someone says, you idiot, it's a fake. This isn't even your body.
Yeah.
It cracked me up.
Even the ghost was duped.
Yes, you have been haunting a plaster cast of yourself. It sounds really funny. I might have to check that out. So then we have a little breakdown about, why did they do this? What was the motivation? Well, one of them obviously was money. There was a lot of money involved in this. A preposterous amount of money, frankly.
Yeah.
Why did people wish to believe it? And we kind of covered that, reaffirmed things they already believed.
Right.
Oh, but the author also felt there might be just a love of the mystery and the romance of the fantastical involved in this. And as we see again and again and again, the specialists get ignored in favor of these things.
Yeah.
So it's not a new thing that we see now. It's something that's been happening for a long time.
Yep.
So he finally ends with, how do we recognize these things when we see them? Because he points out that in this case, not always, but in this case, the scientists were never fooled. They knew right away that it was a problem. But yeah, then we finish with rules for successful archaeological hoax.
Pay attention. Take notes.
Yep. Or don't. Please don't. But one was give the people what they want. Recognize there's a desire for something there. Don't be too successful.
Right.
And then learn from your mistakes.
Yes.
And so we will see with the other hoaxes kind of where they failed, essentially. So last chapter for this episode, we move on to Dawson's Dawn Man, the hoax at Piltdown. Now, this one is just about the Piltdown hoax for you, or do you have more in this chapter as well?
There's
little snippets.
Yeah, there's little snippets of other little things, but it's mostly about Piltdown Man, and it maybe provides some context around other not hoaxes that were found that either helped contribute to this or disprove this later on, kind of thing. But yeah, it was pretty much about the Piltdown Man.
In mine, you probably have this story because he said he did this in 1996. He went to the British Museum of Natural History and tried to view Piltdown remains. He couldn't get access to it.
Yeah.
Now, apparently, it is different. There is a website on their website, a page talking about the Piltdown hoax and how it happened, why it happened, and everything.
Interesting.
Which, frankly, they should.
Yeah, no, and I think those kind of things are important because it allows people to be more skeptical.
Right. He does a good job of, I think, putting into context why this hoax was so successful. And essentially, it starts with the idea that evolution was a thing.
Yeah.
And how solid the explanations were and are, how very nearly on the head Charles Darwin hit it, frankly. It was a remarkable piece of work.
Yeah, and he talks in mine just about On the Origin of Species was so popular and kind of revolutionized and got people thinking about this, whereas
Right.
before it was...
Or there were some ideas that something was going on, but there wasn't a concrete way of approaching and thinking about it.
Well, and again, I think it's Darwin had that creativity and that kind of imagination to ask these questions, to even think that,
and to test it.
Yeah.
Right. That's
yeah.
the thing too, is he tested it so thoroughly and found such great examples of it. Galapagos is a huge one, of course.
Yeah.
And then he followed up later on with his version on human evolution called The Descent of Man.
Yes.
And again, enormously successful. And by about the turn of the century, it was pretty well accepted, apparently, that evolution was a thing.
Yeah.
Interestingly, they were finding Neanderthal skeletons, and they were really confused on where to put these into the system.
Right.
Because these, what were they? Where do they fit into this idea of human evolution? Was this us at one point? People were a little uncomfortable with that idea, I think, too. Eventually, they kind of settled on an idea that the human brain was the first part of humans to develop, because the thought was human intelligence is what makes us different from other animals. And so that is what the human brain has been, a long, slow process. So when they started finding actual human ancestors who had very small brain capacity, it was suggesting the reverse of what people were expecting.
Right.
And because they had upright, more human-like bodies, but heads that were very ape-like.
Right.
And so it suggested that upright walking was the driver for human evolution rather than intelligence.
Right. And obviously some people were not pleased with that.
Well, they were uncomfortable with it at the very least, right? I'm sure some people were not pleased about it, but it was disrupted things. And then they didn't at that time have enough evidence to say for sure that, yes, this is actually what was going on.
Right.
So that's part of the reason I think it was uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, they must around this point where they talked about the nationalism that came with finding these things too, because eventually it became accepted that these were human ancestors.
Right. Like it started in my edition, he starts with Neanderthals, and they were found in the Neander Valley in Germany, kicked off this race to find, you wanted the earliest ancestor of humans in your country, and in some weird way,
because then it's look how old our culture is.
Yeah, look how old our culture is. We
nonsense.
Created humanity, kind of thing.
Right.
And so, and I put in my notes, I was like, I guess the Germans have a long history of interesting nationalism.
Well, it wasn't just them, though, either, right? The French were in on the game. Everyone was trying to do this.
So Cro-Magnon was found in France, and then France was like, yay, look, we got this. And all these other European countries were finding, and this was mostly in Europe that's talked about, but Fujimura was kind of doing the same thing in Japan as well.
And we talked about nationalism and how that can be a motivation for a lot of this.
But all these European countries were finding these ancient ancestors except for England.
And England felt left out.
They did.
So enter Charles Dawson, who found fossils in Piltdown near Sussex in South England. And there's hints about it at first, and then eventually it comes out in more detail. And he declares he has found the fossil of a human ancestor.
Right.
Which England loved, right? Give them what they want. That's one of the first things we've talked about.
Yep. They've been craving this.
Right. Also, the skull matched expectations for what human ancestors should look like. It had a very large cranial capacity, but a jawbone that was more ape-like.
Right.
And again, matching what people were expecting. In this case, particularly matching what scientists were expecting to see.
And what is really important to note here is that the jawbone, the part that would articulate or attach to the cranium, was missing.
Both parts were broken off.
Yes. So it could not articulate, but
also the front teeth were missing, which had the canines.
Right.
And so one of the big distinctions with human teeth versus ape teeth is because we don't have the large canines, our jaws can move sideways to grind, and apes are not able to do that. And so the size of the canines is important, but the molars were smooth, more like what we expect a modern humans to look like. Smoother, anyway.
Interesting.
Right. And they didn't find them right next to each other. They actually found them on the same site. So the proximity was assumed that it was the same creature.
Right.
And if people are saying like, well, the likelihood that they both died here, different species in the same place at the same time, that's not hard to believe, right? So it's got to be. And one of the headlines was Darwin theory proved true. And as we talked about, all the things wrong with that headline, right? And he does a good job when he's going through these case studies of doing callbacks to the ideas he's talked about before without, in that moment at least, beating you over the head about it. He'll come back and talk about, break it down, these things later, but he kind of lets you kind of make those connections as you go through it. And I liked that a lot. It also suggested that the other ancient hominins that people were finding in other parts of Europe may not have been human related, I think was part of the appeal too.
Yes.
So it undermined everyone else's finds.
And did your book have an illustration of their, based on all these findings, what they were thinking, like our human family tree was? I'll show you.
Yeah, I had it.
Okay.
But this is a different image. Actually,
this one's incorrect.
This one is actually the actual image that they would have had at the time.
Oh, that's much cooler.
It's probably the same idea you're seeing in yours. It is incorrect. And let's just say extremely problematic.
It's racist.
Yeah. Yeah, let's just say it as it is.
Yeah, it's definitely racist.
And we'll come back to that maybe.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's going to be discussed in much more detail later on in the book as well.
He shows a corrected timeline in mine later on.
Yeah, he does in mine as well.
Also, importantly, another thing they found on the site was a canine, which again matched expectations. It was not the large ape-like canine, it was a more human-like canine, but not a part of the jaw. Importantly.
Right. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, and so many were a little skeptical, but didn't question it much because, like I said, what are the chances, right?
Yeah.
And no one was willing to, or it didn't occur to anyone to even, I guess, question the person who was finding it.
Yeah, yeah.
But problems started to happen. Oh, at some point, Dawson did find a second Piltdown Man.
Yeah, and
no one else did, which is interesting.
Right, yeah, look at that. Again, getting lucky, right? That what happens when you get too lucky. People start to get suspicious of you. They also found and I'm using quotes here, the cricket bat.
Oh, yes.
So cricket, obviously the sport, not the little bug, the national pastime of Great Britain, right? And they found this carved
bone tool
that resembled a cricket bat. And that was kind of like, oh, look, these folks were playing our national pastime essentially back in prehistory.
Was that the actual interpretation? I wasn't sure.
Yeah, it was kind of implying that
cricket was that old.
Well, not only look how civilized they were, and look how much they were like us, so
I don't recall it going into that detail in mine.
He does a little bit in mine. It's only like a small paragraph, but it was pretty funny because I was like, oh my gosh, nobody really thought that was weird.
Yeah. And so this was accepted for a while.
Yeah.
But as time wore on, more and more ancient human ancestors were found. And so essentially all of this evidence kept showing up of ancient humans with human-like bodies, but not as large brains.
So this was like a weird outlier.
Yeah, and so it was interesting because what's going on here? Where does this fit then? As the question remained. Eventually, quite some time later, they did some chemical testing on it, and they finally found out that this was a hoax.
Yeah, this was in the 1940s, right?
They didn't necessarily accept that it was a hoax right away. Actually, that's important.
Yes.
So they were testing fluorine in the bones, and essentially, as things are in water, as bones are in the ground, water interacting with them will build up fluorine in the bones, and that gives you a good idea of ancient ages beyond what carbon dating would work in this case. And they found out, no, this was not near as old as everyone thought. It was no more than 50,000 years ago, but it still didn't fit. Finally, here's what it was. I think they tested the fossils that were found with it, the animal fossils.
That's right,
and that's where they got the 50,000 year
right
date. They didn't have anything as conclusive with the jaw or cranium, but another test was done a few years later, and they found out that the two were actually different dates,
Different dates and different
creatures.
Yes.
And finally, everyone started taking a closer look, and they found that the cranium was actually modern human, stained to look older, and the bone thickness was unusually thick. They think it may have been like maybe a pathological thing, or I didn't quite understand this, but maybe a result of some chemical treatment to make it look thicker. And then the jaw was actually an orangutan jaw.
Right.
They had identified this through DNA testing. And that, again, would explain why the connecting points were broken off, because there's no way orangutan jaw would connect to a human skull.
Right.
It's just not the right size.
They looked at teeth under an electron microscope and found evidence of them having been filed down using like a metal file.
Basically, little metal marks
Yeah.
in it still, I think.
And I thought it was interesting too that like the pulp in the teeth was exact same substance as chewing gum.
Exact or similar, I thought. I didn't fully understand the relevance to that, to the whole uncovering the myth.
I'm wondering if they were using, well, and this was, I was like, okay, at that, because I can understand like now trying to like put tooth pulp in there because we have like DNA testing, but obviously chewing gum isn't going to do the trick. But then also like they didn't even have any test that I know of. They didn't have any testing that they could do. I'm wondering if it was meant as like an adhesive or something. I have no idea. I don't know why it was there.
Yeah.
I would like to know more. If anybody knows, let us know.
So then the question becomes, well, who done it?
Why
did this
interesting.
happen? The obvious suspect is Charles Dawson himself. He was well known and respected, and he was an amateur, which isn't necessarily a given, of course, but maybe suggested a drive for fame in this context. He donated a lot of his stuff to the British Museum, and he had other things named after him, a dinosaur fossil and a plant, apparently. But basically, he's a primary suspect because he was just too lucky. He's the only person to find both, only person present at both places when they were found. Also, weird that he waited till now to point this out, but he's also the caretaker of the manor where they found the original one. Like, well,
yeah, he had like continual
suspicious.
Access and familiarity with the sites.
So some think he acted alone. The author is not so sure. There's potential co-conspirators, but most of them have, according to the author, reasonable alibis, it seemed.
Yeah, and he went through in my edition person by person, listing like, you know, how likely they were as a suspect. And I don't know if we want to go through every single person.
I don't. I didn't look at them. I kind of skimmed them personally.
Yeah. I mean, essentially, there are other people who may have at least played a role.
They could have motivations, but they all seem to have alibis.
Yeah. And so it was, I mean, Dawson is the most likely suspect, and some of these people may or may not have helped him out. Some people even suspected like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, like the author of Sherlock Holmes, which I'm like,
I didn't understand that.
Yeah, it was like, why would people do that?
He does reference Conan Doyle, and when he's talking about how were the scientists fooled, because he points out that, you know, who did it and why is not really the important question here.
Right,
it's
exactly.
Like, why did it take so long to find out?
Mm-hmm.
And he cites a Sherlock Holmes story in particular where Holmes finds something the police had missed. And they asked, how did you find that? And his response is, I found it because I was looking for it. And that's the case here, right?
Yeah.
In this case, scientists ultimately found out about the hoax because they were looking for it. They hadn't looked closely enough before.
Yeah.
So this is an example of scientific process not quite taking longer than it should probably, but ultimately working like it's supposed to, right?
And I'm like, you know, and in this day and age, kind of like how Fujimura found out, it would be much more difficult to create a hoax, I guess, like in this sense, like by salting the ground with artifacts or something like that. There's definitely a whole host of ways that, which maybe he'll get into, how you can create a hoax using the internet and spread misinformation, stuff like that. I'm not saying that's any more difficult. That's probably easier. You don't even need the thing in the ground anymore for people to come visit. But he does mention in my book that now we have many more pre-human remains, right?
Yeah.
We have Lucy, we have more Neanderthals have been found, you know, more of our ancestors have been found. So it would take a lot more evidence to drastically change the course of our understanding for our human history and prehistory.
Oh, can we go back a little bit? Well, actually, related to this too, this is where he talks about the current chronology of humans and human ancestry. And it's important to talk about this in contrast to the racist one we were shown before. The big important difference is there is only one Homo sapien. There is only one human species now. Every person in the world is of the same species. And that's different from the old one where they were trying to separate out different groups as a separate species from particularly Europeans, I assume.
Yeah, they were, even if it wasn't like outright racism, it was preconceived notions based on racial superiority and other factors of the time.
And assumptions that had no real basis
Right.
and were untested. And
Yeah.
And frankly, colonialism. You know, it's got to be related to that because it gave justification for a lot of the actions.
Mhm.
Like that's the sort of thing that was going on. So that's important. And that's at the end of this chapter. And I appreciated him really pointing that out.
Yeah, he didn't really hammer that one home in this book. So
He
I'm glad
really did here, yeah.
I'm glad he added that because I think it's really, really important.
So I think that about wraps up the chapter. Do you have anything else, Barbara?
No, I do not.
Okay. For next time, Barbara, what are we going to read?
All right. So, and again, depending on what edition you're using, I don't know if the titles change, but we will be reading chapter 5 through chapter 8. The titles sound really interesting. Tristan, the chapter 5, Who Discovered America? You're going to like that one, I think. And then, of course, The Myth of the Mound Builders.
That's going to be interesting.
Mm-hmm. Lost One Continent Reward. Not sure what that's about.
It's got to be about Atlantis.
Oh, yeah, you're probably right. And then Prehistoric E.T., The Fantasy of Ancient Astronauts. I'm pretty excited. Do you have any different? Are your titles slightly different?
I might need to read through chapter 9 in that case, because Prehistoric ET is chapter 9 for me.
Oh, what is chapter?
So mine are chapter 5, Who Discovered America? Chapter 6, Who's Next After the Indians Before Columbus? Chapter 7, The Myth of the Mound Builders. Chapter 8, Lost One Continent, and then Prehistoric ET.
Oh, so you have a extra whole.
No.
But no, that'll be interested to hear what you have to say about your extra chapter you have to read.
Yeah. Goody. All right, but I think that wraps us up, and I think this podcast has already gone on plenty long, and I have to edit it all. So let's stop it here, Barbara. So that's what we'll pick up next time. So is there a question you want to ask people so they can leave us a comment or something?
Sure. I would love to hear what your favorite hoax is, scientific hoax, and it doesn't have to be one that's mentioned in the book. I'm sure there are tons out there, but I would be really curious to hear what you all like as far as what your favorite hoax is. That'd be fun.
Or fascinated by.
Yeah.
Leave us that comment, and we'll see you next time.
All right. Happy reading, everyone.
Archaeology Books for Fun is brought to you by the Florida Public Archaeology Network, a program of the University of West Florida. You can find out more about archaeology and about FPAN at fpan.us. We appreciate any feedback, so if you're listening to us as a podcast, please leave us a review, and if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Thanks for listening.